Hey, so last summer, me and my family, my extended family, we decided we were going to have a big family get-together. I don't know if any of you guys do that in your families. I know the Fiddies probably do. They're always doing something fun with their families. But we decided to go and have a big family get-together. And they hired this big old family home somewhere down in Kent for a week. And it was 4 families, 17 of us. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, dogs. It was absolute chaos. But one morning, whilst everyone else was out enjoying the sun, one of my cousins came to me and he asked if he could ask a question. He said, "You're quite religious, Sam." Where's this going? "How could God allow me to be sick?" Now, I'll give you a little bit of context. This was one of my youngest cousins who's been diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a rare disorder with no known cure. And he's in constant pain, and it's a debilitating syndrome. And this situation has turned a once really energetic and enthusiastic young boy into a dejected, frustrated, disappointed kid who'd lost almost all hope of ever getting better. Bitterness and anger replacing joy. And as his talents and ambitions and passions seem to be caged and restrained by this debilitating diagnosis. And his questions continued. Why would God let this happen to me? God is supposed to be good, right? I just can't find it in me to believe in a God that would allow this to happen to me. We've been praying for so long, but nothing seems to happen. Does God even exist? If he did exist, I don't think I'd want to believe in him anyway. And I was dumbstruck. I didn't know what to say. And in my desperation to provide some sort of hope for him to cling to, I tried to answer his questions, but I could tell it wasn't helping. Have you ever been hit with questions that shake you to your core? That make your heart sink and your tongue tied? As you claw in the dark for some kind of answer that will satisfy the person asking, all the while you know that nothing you say is going to help them at all, and nothing you say will help them overcome the darkness in which they dwell. His questions shook me to the core. And as this rather one-sided conversation came to an end, I felt so rubbish. I knew I hadn't managed to help. His situation seemed so hopeless, and I felt so helpless in the wake of his questions. Have you ever been faced with questions like these? Have you ever had conversations like these with anyone? All around us, people are suffering from things that seem completely out of their control. What do you do when they get back that diagnosis and the prognosis is terminal? How do you convince people that God is still good even though they've lost someone? How on earth do you answer these kinds of questions? Cancer in children, natural disasters, unexpected deaths. And maybe you're here today and you've experienced situations like these, or maybe you know someone who has or is currently going through a dark situation. Maybe you have a loved one or a close friend or family member who's going through a dark situation and they've lost hope. And no matter how hard you try, you just can't find the right answers for them. All around us, people struggle with sickness, pain. People are in pain. And it's not just sickness that throws people into dark situations. Maybe it's struggling to keep on top of finances as debt looms at the door, or maybe it's a job and it seems to have hit a dead end, and there's a lost sense of purpose there. Or maybe it's losing someone unexpectedly and struggling to cope with the grief. A miscarriage, a terrifying diagnosis, a drunk driver. Dark situations can hit us out of nowhere and shake us to the core, causing us to lose hope. Causing us to question God. Now, I don't know your story. And I don't know what you've been through or what you've experienced, but I do know that everyone is searching for answers that seem unanswerable. And I know that there are people going through incredibly dark situations, incredibly tough situations. And these situations we experience can feel debilitating. And in the midst of the darkness, we experience fear, doubt, pain, sadness, anger, frustration, confusion, and desperation. And maybe you're in this room this morning, and you're in that dark situation, and there seems to be no hope. But whoever you are, however you found us today, whether a friend dragged you along this morning, or you're watching on the live stream or on YouTube, or listening via the podcast, whatever your journey has been to get here, I hope that you'll be able to get something out of what we talk about today. And in fact, whether you call yourself a Christian or not, I hope that you can find something in what we talk about today that's going to help you in your situation. I told you it was going to get dark. But I want to explore a story of a man named Jairus. And I think Jairus would have experienced some of these emotions that we just talked about, if not all of them, as he tried to navigate a dark situation of his own. And from his story, I hope that we can learn something. I hope that we can pick things out, and that will help us navigate our own dark situations. And the story is found in Mark 5:21. I'm going to read from my Bible, but it'll be on the screen behind us. It reads like this: When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. You know, the first thing that we need to see from this passage is that Jairus was going through an incredibly dark situation, but he didn't give up hope. Instead, in his darkness, he went to find Jesus. And I think that's the first thing that we need to do. When we experience a dark situation, we need to find hope. And where do we find this hope? We find it in Jesus. Now, in 1 Timothy 1, it refers to Jesus. You know, Jesus himself, our living hope. Our hope is found in Jesus. And Jairus was in a pretty tough situation, a pretty dark situation. His daughter, who was only 12 years old, was dying. His only daughter was dying. And Jairus came to Jesus in desperation. Now, his daughter was on death's door, and he would lose her if Jesus didn't do something, and do something quickly. You know, Jairus was probably fearful. He was probably frustrated. He was probably confused as to why his innocent little girl should have to suffer. You know, Jairus, being a leader of the synagogue, a good man, a God-fearing, obedient man, was probably thinking, what have I ever done to deserve this? But in the midst of his pain and anguish, Jairus had hope because he had a lifeline. Jesus was in town. You know, and as we read that line where he pleads with Jesus, he says, "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Jairus' language is that of a man who still has hope. You know, your situation may seem desperate and bleak and hopeless, but when God turns up, there is always hope. When Jairus was in need of hope, he looked for Jesus. And when we are in need of hope, we need to look for Jesus. Let's continue in the passage. Verse 24. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that the power had gone from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered. "Yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, every time I read this story, or every time I've read this story in the past, you know, of this woman who was healed by just touching Jesus' cloak, I've always thought about it as a happy account. an incredible miracle, a testament to faith. But I've never read it through Jairus' eyes. Jesus had agreed to follow Jairus to his home to heal his daughter, and time was of the essence. But on the way, something slows them down. And here is a man desperate for Jesus to heal his daughter, to reach his daughter in time so that he can heal her before she dies. And the crowds are so big and it's impossible to move. But then Jesus stops. Jairus' anxiety must have been through the roof. Jesus, why are you stopping? My daughter's about to die. I reckon that Jairus witnessed this miracle with a mixture of joy and sorrow. What an incredible miracle that's just taken place. But please, Jesus, don't forget about my daughter. In that moment, Jairus must have thought, Jesus, if you can heal this woman unintentionally by her just touching your clothes, then surely you can just heal my daughter here, right now. And often we see what God is doing for others, and we see how he has healed others and brought them through financial difficulties, restored broken relationships, provided opportunities, given others peace. Some people seem to have an overflow of God's blessing in their lives. And we look at other situations and we start questioning God. Why won't you do that for me? Have I not been faithful? Have I not consistently tithed? Have I not continued to serve you? Have I not been good to my friends and families? Have I not been a friend to those in need? As I've already mentioned, Jairus was a leader of the synagogue, a good man, a God-fearing man, obeyed God's laws. And if I was Jairus, this is what I would have been thinking. Jairus would have had every right to question these things of God, if that's how God worked. You see, we try and qualify ourselves for God's provision, but it's not by works that we are saved or healed or restored or set free. It's through grace. God has already provided for us through Jesus on the cross, and there is nothing that we can do to earn God's love for us. He has already given it freely. The thing that stops us, the thing that causes us to lose hope, is the fact that we are basing the validity of God's love for us based on his alignment to our timeline. We want God to move now. We want God to fix this now. We want him to bring us out of the darkness now. But the truth is, God's timing is different from ours. His timeline is different from ours. And sometimes we just need to wait just that little bit longer. We need to endure the journey. Just because we don't see immediate change doesn't mean that God isn't working. You see, Jairus stayed with Jesus during the time it took to get to his daughter. Jairus endured the interruptions. He endured the crowds. He even endured the miracles on the way to see his daughter healed. Jairus would have wanted to see Jesus heal his daughter straight away. Of course he would. But he knew that God's timeline doesn't always align to our expectations. Sometimes we need to wait just a little bit longer. And in Psalms 27:14 it says, "Here is what I have learned through it all. Don't give up. Don't be impatient. Be intertwined as one with the Lord. Be brave. Be courageous. Never lose hope. Yes, keep on waiting, for he will never disappoint you." Sometimes we just need to learn to wait patiently, to wait on the Lord. Because God is never late. He is always on time. Whatever that time is, he comes for us at the appropriate time. Let's finish the story of Jairus. Mark 5:35. Whilst Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." And he did not allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw the commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And after he had put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. And what's interesting about Jairus' story is that it would have been so easy to give up, right? It would have been so easy to give up hope. Jesus knew the end of Jairus' story. He knew that there would be joy at the end. He knew that he would be able to not heal his daughter, but bring her back from the dead. He knew that there was going to be an incredible miracle. But Jairus didn't know that. Jairus didn't know that Jesus was going to heal his daughter. So Jairus' story shows us that despite experiencing incredibly dark situations, you can still have hope. Throughout the journey, Jairus maintained hope. How? In his darkness, he went to find Jesus, and he cried out to Jesus. He had every opportunity to let doubt overcome him. Let the crowd tear him away from Jesus, to allow the negative thoughts to consume him, to listen to people telling him to give up, go home. But instead, he was filled with hope to the end, expecting that Jesus would even raise her from the dead. Hope is not dead, even when our not finished, even when the trial seems like it will never end. Jairus showed us that our hope remains whilst we remain with Jesus. Our hope remains whilst we remain with Jesus. Jairus' hope was based on what he knew of Jesus and knew about God from the scriptures. As we've mentioned multiple times already, Jairus was a religious leader, a leader of the synagogue. He was well schooled in the scriptures. From a young boy and now as a religious leader, as a teacher. His hope was based upon God's nature and character that is found in the Bible. And that is what we need to base our own hope on as well. The nature and character of God based in the Bible. Instead of letting your dark situation warp your opinion of who God is and warp your opinion of God's goodness and faithfulness, we need to understand what the Bible says about God's nature and character. If you're struggling with a dark situation, or you don't have the answers for someone who is, hope is found in Jesus. Hope is not pretending everything is fine. It's believing that it will be. Hope is what carries us through. You may feel frustrated, fearful, full of doubt, full of pain, sadness, anger, confusion, desperation, but don't lose your hope. Jairus realized that the only thing that was going to get him through his trial was his hope in Jesus. The future looked bleak. The outcome looked uncertain, but God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We might not know his plan, but we can know that he has a plan for you, for me, for everybody in this room. And when we feel like we can't go any further, when we think that all we can do is to succumb to our hopelessness, draw close to Jesus. Jairus went to find Jesus, his source of hope. He stayed with Jesus, and during the journey, he stayed close to Jesus. When we stay close to Jesus, that is when we are able to hear his voice. Despite the chaos, despite the noise, despite the crushing weight of our circumstances, we can hear, don't be afraid, just believe. Jesus renews our hope. He renews our strength. He gives us strength to carry on just that little bit longer. We hope in the dark when we draw close to Jesus. So in the midst of your doubt, draw close to Jesus. In the midst of your pain, draw close to Jesus. In the midst of your frustration, draw close to Jesus. When you're tired of the waiting, draw close to Jesus. When you see no end to the darkness, draw close to Jesus. We know it may not be where we want to be, but we know that we are not where we were. We know that it is by grace that we are saved, and God is working all things together for our good. So we draw close to Jesus. Take your focus off of your situation, what you know to be true. Take our focus off of the things that will cause us to lose hope. And fix your focus on the voice of God, allowing him to restore your hope and guide you through your dark situation. Although we don't know when God will deliver us through the darkness we may find ourselves in, we do know that God will be there in the midst of it, helping us through. See, Jairus determined that no matter what life threw at him, he was going to stay with Jesus. He determined to stay close to Jesus and trust in his promises, even when it would have been hard, even when the pain was unbearable, even when his miracle didn't happen straight away, even when others were blessed and he wasn't, even when people told him to give up and go home, even when the report came in that his daughter had already died, even when people said that there was no hope left, Jairus stayed close to Jesus, close enough to hear him say, "Do not be afraid, just believe." We can stay close to Jesus, even in our context, even today. We stay close to Jesus when we lift our hands in surrender and worship, and we pour out our heart to him. We stay close to Jesus when we seek his voice, when we study the true nature and character of God by reading our Bibles. We stay close to Jesus when we seek God's voice in prayer, and we wait on him in the quiet. This is how we draw close to Jesus. And the truth is, pain still exists. Suffering still exists. Darkness still exists. And for weeks afterwards and many times since, my cousin's questions still haunt me. I know there's no easy answer, and there is definitely no quick fix. But if we've learned anything today from the story of Jairus, God is not finished with you even when it seems hopeless. God is not finished with you even when you can't see a way out. God is not finished with you yet. God's timeline is different from our expectations. So although it may not seem like it, God still has a plan for you. He's not going to leave you in this darkness. We need to stay hopeful. Hope can carry us through the darkest night until we see the brightness of dawn. Hope can give us strength when we feel like we can't carry on. Hope gives us direction when we're not sure which way to turn. Hope gives us joy when there is sadness. Hope brings peace when there is fear and desperation creeps in. Hope comes from Jesus. Our hope remains whilst we remain with Jesus. Draw close to him. Imagine if we could do this. There wouldn't be anything that life could throw at us that would knock us down. Sure, the wind might get knocked out of our lungs. We might be shaken to the core. We might still be experiencing the darkest situation that we ever have. But we would still be able to stand tall and say, "This will not defeat me. Sickness will not defeat me. Depression will not defeat me. Death will not defeat me. Debt will not defeat me. Loss will not defeat me. I am strong because Jesus is stronger. The night is dark, but I have the light of the world in me. You better get out of my way because I have a world to change and nothing is going to stop me. I choose to hope in Jesus. I'm not staying here. I have places to be. I have places to be. I'm not going to let this stop me from being all God has called me to be. I believe in Jesus. When we have hope in Jesus, nothing can defeat us. And if this is how we choose to fight our way through the dark, imagine as we become an example for others to look at. They will see hope when they should have seen despair. And they will look at us to help them battle their own darkness, their own situations. And we can say, "I know what you need. You need hope. Let me introduce you to him. His name is Jesus. My hope comes from Jesus." See, when we draw close to Jesus, our source of hope, we let our lives become an example of how to have hope in the dark.